Welcome everyone to this webinar conversation today with John Médaille from the USA on the theme of economic collapse or cooperation, looking at what's happening in the economy, particularly in the US, but also around the world, and also what alternatives we have, particularly from the point of view of Catholic teaching. In our webinars for the Australian Cardine Institute, we usually begin with what we call an acknowledgement of country, which is a recognition of the Indigenous owners of the land. And we also have a short opening prayer, which I will now present to you. So we would like to begin this webinar by acknowledging the Indigenous people of Australia, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, those of us who are in Australia, on which we meet today. And we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to any other Indigenous Australians or Indigenous peoples who may be with us today. I'll now read the YCW opening prayer, which, even though we're not quite as young as we used to be, still expresses the spirituality of the movement that many of us still try to live. Lord Jesus, a worker like me, help me and all my fellow workers to think like you, to work with you, to pray through you, to live in you, to give you all my strength and all my time. May your kingdom come in all our factories, farms, workshops, offices, and our homes. Be everywhere, better known, better loved, and better served. Deliver us from injustice and hatred, from evil and sin. May our souls remain in your grace today, and may the soul of every worker who died on Labour's battlefield rest in peace. Amen. So we particularly remember the martyrs of the movement. There were many of the martyrs, not just of the Young Christian Workers, but of the Young Christian students and other Cardine movements. Many of them, in fact, have their I don't want to say commemorating their 80th anniversary this year, died towards the end of the Second World War in Nazi concentration camps. So we keep them in mind today, and all those others who suffered in Latin America and other parts of the world, and also in the countries that are suffering today. We remember particularly Gaza, Sudan, Papua, West Papua, in the part of Indonesia. Amen. So now I'd just like to move on to introducing John, our speaker today. Some of you from the USA will know John, and even a couple of our people here today from Australia have also known John or read some of his works over the years. John's a businessman from Texas, also a Vietnam War veteran, but now he's become an instructor in theology at the University of Dallas, where he specializes in teaching Catholic social encyclicals to business students. Over the course of many years, he's also written a number of books which relate to economic issues particularly, and I must say often critiques what's happening in the light of Catholic teaching and putting forward alternatives, particularly from the point of view of that Catholic-inspired philosophy of distributism. Maybe I'll just note here a person we mentioned beforehand, an Australian promoter of distributism, Race Matthews, an Australian Labor politician who died a few months ago and who's known in Australia for his work in that field. But here today, we're here to listen to John. So John, you've prepared something, and would like to use that to start off the discussion. So I'll hand over to you now. Thanks very much, John.
Let me start by first I want to thank you, Stefan, and I want to thank everybody who is here tonight. I'm very, very well flattered and gratified as well. And I hope I can make this worth the time that you've spent. Let me start just by summarizing the article. I think there was a link to the article, but instead of reading that whole article, I'll just make kind of a summary of it right here. Okay, so I begin by making an assertion that the American economy has been in a state of near collapse since 2008 and has been sustained, that is, collapse avoided, only through vast injections of government money into the economy. These injections of money we call the annual deficit. Obama, for example, in dealing with the bailouts and a collapsed economy, increased the debt by 65%. Donald Trump, in just one term, increased it by 40%. And Joe Biden, in dealing with an epidemic and the threat again of economic shutdown, increased it by 31%. But this is nothing new in the history of liberalism. Indeed, liberalism has never been able to achieve economic equilibrium, that is, the balance of supply and demand, without the help of the government. It has always relied on the government as the consumer of last resort, without which it cannot achieve equilibrium. The whole history of liberalism, a philosophy of limited government, reveals that government never grows as fast as it does under small government liberalism. The Reagan and Bush administrations, for example, while promising smaller government, actually tripled the national debt from 700 billion to 2.1 trillion. Now, by liberalism, I mean something quite specific. I mean the doctrine that arose mainly in the 18th and 19th centuries, which rejected all previous authorities, and most especially the authority of the Catholic Church, to rely on a pure rationalism. I mean the doctrine that rejected organic communities in favor of a pure individualism. I mean a philosophy which substituted a faith in God for a faith in the ability of science that would, given enough time and funding, explain all things in material terms. I mean a view of society which replaced the common good with a pure self-interest as the organizing principle of economic and political life. Rationalism, scientism, individualism, and self-interest. These are the core values of liberalism, and taken together they form the philosophy known as utilitarianism. This philosophy has found its way into conservatism. In truth, what passes for American conservatism is, in large measure, the purest form of liberal utilitarianism. This philosophy has found its way into conservatism, and in truth, what passes for American conservatism is, in large measure, the purest form of liberal utilitarianism. American conservatism exhibits a cultural schizophrenia, trying to marry a social conservatism with an economic liberalism, and a more unsuitable marriage I cannot imagine. So, how did this liberalism become conservative? Actually, this is part of a standard historical process, one that is repeated over and over again. Some wit has observed that yesterday's Whig is always today's Tory, and the content of conservatism is always the discarded liberalism of a previous age. Liberalism and the political and economic interests it serves defeats the old order, the ancien régime. But at the same time, it begins to engender its own negations. Nothing is ever denied until it is first affirmed. But the denials rarely take the form of a return to the older system because the economic base that supported that system is gone. The new denials are actually within the domain of the affirmations. So, for example, in the place of a pure individualism, a collectivism is asserted. In the place of a pure rationalism, a historical mysticism. In the place of self-interest, an absurd altruism. But note that these are only apparent opposites, not real ones. Collectivism is not the opposite of individualism. It's what happens to individuals in the absence of any organic community. Mysticism is not the opposite of rationalism, because rationalism is already a kind of mysticism. Lord knows it is anything but rational. In the same way, scientism is not the opposite of historicism, because it is already a childlike belief in the glorious future. Nevertheless, from the standpoint of, say, collectivism, individualism appears to be conservative. The old Whig becomes the new Tory. So, the question becomes, can we recover a real conservatism, or are we condemned to just becoming superannuated liberals? I think the first task is to question each element of the prevailing liberalism. For example, liberalism in the economic realm claims that people always act in their own self-interest, and in doing so, they unwittingly create an economic and social order that results in the greatest good for the greatest number. Demand curves, reflecting as they do each person's self-interest, add up to the total interest of society and hence to the common good. There is a certain plausibility to this, in that people would act in their self-interest if only they had any idea of what that was. The great truth about self-interest is that it is never something known in advance. It is always something discovered by experience. Who among us has not had the experience of getting exactly what we wanted, only to find out that it wasn't what we wanted at all? Or of fearing the worst, and to find out that it was really all for the best? Self-interest always remains in the future that great unknown. Hence, it is the most useless of all economic quantities. So demand curves do not reflect our collective self-interest, but our collective desires. And it is a great mistake to confuse that which we desire with that which is in our self-interest. And while there might be a certain plausibility in asserting that the common good is only the summation of private goods, although surely this commits the fallacy of composition, there is no possible moral calculus that can transform private desires into the public good. In regard to desires, the only things we can know are what we desire and what we ought to desire. But modern economists fear that dreaded word ought. They fear that it will bring in questions of value and hence demote them from being scientists to the lowly status of philosophers, and moral philosophers at that. However, without an ought, there can be no analysis. Without knowing what a thing ought to do, we cannot measure how well it is doing it. But the second question is more interesting still. For without asking what we ought to desire, desires will be disordered, and disordered desires lead to a disordered economy. If the things we desire are wasteful, we lay waste to the planet. If greed is our goal, we create systems of oppression. If we want wealth without work, we create systems of debt leading to bankruptcy. Disordered desires are the sign of immaturity, whether for a person or a society, And utilitarianism is simply immaturity raised to the level of a philosophy. However, it is not enough to attack the utilitarian basis of economics. We must also show why its first concern should be, as it was for Aristotle and Aquinas, justice. But here we face a problem, for there are multiple accounts of justice. So along with Alasdair MacIntyre, we must ask, whose justice? There are indeed two differing accounts of justice here. The utilitarian account is based on liberty. That is, if the wage contract is reached by free consent, then the wage is just and needs no further justification. But Adam Smith pointed out the problem with this account more than 250 years ago. Namely, he noted, in any wage negotiation, one party may survive without working, while the other party could not long survive without the work. One party stands on the independence of wealth, and the other on the compulsion of poverty. In other words, the negotiation is about power, not productivity. And such contracts cannot justly set the wage. The CEO earns 500 times what the line worker does, not because he is 500 times more productive, but because he is 500 times more powerful. The seamstress in a sweatshop makes a pittance, not because her productivity is low, but because her power is pitiful. The utilitarian account states that liberty will result in justice, but the traditional account reverses that order. Justice results in liberty, and specifically, it is distributive justice that is at issue. The justice which proclaims that each person should get from production neither more nor less than what he or she contributes to production. That is, there should be no wealth without work, nor any work without wealth. In our system, this is viewed as a contest between capital and labor, and for decades, capital has been winning the contest. Since 1973, here in the United States, the median wage for the white male worker has been flat. And this despite that productivity for all classes of labor has exploded. Women and minorities have made some real gains, but from a much lower base. What this means is that the worker is required to clear larger markets on the same wage. This is an impossibility, and it explains why it is necessary for the government to become the consumer of last resort, and must always grow as the workers' share decreases. The historical truth is that every social collapse is preceded by a growing division between the rich and the rest. And this is true in every age of human history. A small group of oligarchs gains control of most of the productive property and amasses great fortunes, while the people sink into debt slavery. This is a story that reaches back to every corner of the world and every era of history. With extreme divisions, the rich get extremely arrogant, and the rest grow extremely resentful. I leave it to your own reading to read out how that is playing in our society and politics today in this age of Trump. And allow me to suggest that the visible sign of economic justice is the widest possible division distribution of productive property. Now, I suggest we take up this claim in our discussion. For now, I will suggest that despite liberalism's claim to be based on a system of private property, the truth is that private property plays almost no role in the economy. Yes, we might all own some private property, perhaps in our homes or our cars or even a small farm or a small business. But the heights of the economy are controlled by vast corporate collectives, with from 2 to 5 firms controlling 80% or more of any given market sector. Capitalism has collectivized the economy beyond the dreams of any Stalinist bureaucrat. Or as G.K. Chesterton put it, capitalism and communism are very much alike, especially capitalism. Capitalism has been confounded with the free market, but in fact, it is the market's strongest enemy. A free market is a market where any good or service is provided by a wide variety of competing firms. But capitalism does not produce free markets, but collectives operating as cartels in a cartelized economy. And finally, I should note that there is not now, nor ever has been in all of human history, any economy that has run on pure liberal principles. I know of no exception to this rule. Distributism, on the other hand, is on the ground and working, and we can look at actual working examples to determine if it will work for us. And there are many large and long-standing examples that we may examine. I trust that most in this audience know at least something of these examples, but I'll mention here the Mondragon Cooperative Corporation of Spain, the cooperative economy of Emilia-Romagna, employee stock ownership firms like Jack Stack Springfield Remanufacturing Company, Ricardo Semler's employer-run Semco, and cooperatives, mutual banks, mutual insurance companies of every size and description. With all that in mind, let me suggest that any practical reform will have to have 4 goals in mind. 1, remoralize the markets. 2, relocalize the economy. 3, recapitalize the poor and the middle class. And 4, recenter the economy around the family and the community. With all that as background, I would like for us to discuss both the theoretical and the practical issues surrounding the current collapse. Now, I have some possible questions for discussion, but don't feel bound by this list. They are merely suggestions. So, for example, we can ask, are we really in a state of collapse, or can the system reform itself within the bounds of liberalism? Are the 4 goals listed the proper ones, or even possible? Is the division of property really an issue? And what practical steps can we take to reach this goal? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, I think you've given us a lot to think about in that last little period of time. Yes, incredible presentation, and I think extremely relevant to not only what's happening in the USA, but also to our own reality in Australia. So I asked a few people who are here today if you'd like to prepare a couple of questions or comments for John. I think Carl has already, oh yes, I will just say Tony's put it in the chat there too. If you would like to share your comments or questions in the chat, that's another possibility as well. So thanks for reminding me that, Tony. But I was just going to mention that I was in contact with Carl Schmud and also with Garrick Small, that you both have a possibly a few comments or questions to help us kick off the conversation. So would you like to start, Carl?
Well, thank you, Stefan, and thank you for inviting John to address us. It's been tremendously stimulating and mind overwhelming in a way. John, you've covered so many points, but brought things together very well in a most integrated way, I thought, particularly analysing the philosophical and historical roots of liberalism and the extent to which that's been the both obvious but also underlying philosophy that's governed modern society as well as the modern economy. One point I might raise for discussion is it does seem to me that the fundamental flaw in liberalism is anthropological. I think St. Pope John Paul II pointed this out, and others have as well, no doubt, that they don't really understand human nature in its fullness. They understand the aspirational drive of human beings and the desire for freedom, although I might make a comment about that in a moment, if I may. But a deep understanding of human weakness and human capacity for evil and manipulation, and you emphasise very well, I think, power. Our power is such a pivotal force. That seems to me what's underlay the errors that then manifest themselves in the economy over this long period, that they don't really understand the fullness of human nature. Would you or others may like to comment on that or discuss it?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, an excellent point of analysis. There is a severe anthropological error in individualism that posits that we are isolated individual making our own choices, etc., etc. But in fact, as Aristotle points out, we are political beings, and I would say we are social beings. We are all called forth into being into the little community of the family. Okay. And from this family, we receive, gifts, not exchanges. We receive gifts. We receive, of course, the gift of life, but we receive the gifts of love. We receive material gifts. We receive the gifts of language. We receive our first experience of community, etc., etc. We cannot be understood at all as individuals. And indeed, I do not like the term individual at all. I prefer the term person, the human person, rather than the human individual. And what is the difference? Well, a person is always a being in relationship. Okay, so for example, and the model here is the Trinity. Now, in 2,000 years of theology, we've made every possible mistake you can think of about the Trinity. But one thing nobody ever said about the Trinity is that there are three individuals in one God. That's the one mistake nobody ever made. There are three persons, and the names of those persons are names of relationships. So you can only be a father in virtue of having an offspring. You can only be a son in virtue to a parent. And the Spirit is the spirit of the love between the two. So it too names a relationship. Okay, so, and that's what we are. We are images of the divine persons. Okay, we are always in relationship. We cannot be understood apart from language, culture, family, community, nation, etc., etc. And that's the anthropological error of individualism.
Thanks very much, John. Garrick, would you have a comment or a question at this stage?
Yes, no, thanks, Stefan. And thank you, John. I think you did an excellent job, John, of pointing out on pretty much at the beginning of your talk, and I think it frames it, the way that I think most of us, most of people in the developed world, get lost in an argument between two types of liberalism. And right, and you've picked up that these two liberalisms are both really, really bad. It's Chesterton's Hudge and Gudge against Jones. It's the false polarity where both are looking to what they can take.
Mm-hmm.
And when you contrast that to the family, as you did just then, the family is a community of gift, not a contract community of taking. I noticed there's a comment or a question that's just come up about equalising the power of workers and bosses. I'd be interested in your comments, John, because I don't think you're talking about the equalisation of power, but something else in terms of how to get that to work properly.
Well, two things there. Yes, you're absolutely right that all of our battles today are political battles between liberals, between right-wing liberals and left-wing liberals. And I think the proper answer is a plague on both your houses. But tell me again your second question.
I was just moving towards the idea of equalising power between workers, because
yes,
the language of power, I think, is the relationship, the anthropology of hell myself, where it's all about what I can take, how much I can hate the other person, whereas the alternate anthropology is something else.
Yeah. That's an interesting way of looking at it. And I hadn't thought about the relationship of power as the relationship in the way you put it. But I think that's certainly a possibility. However, I don't think it needs to be that way. I think when, say, employers and employees have kind of equal powers, they kind of tend to negotiate their differences and reach a common accord. When they're all united in a goal, when their goals can be reconciled, then the negotiations of power tend to benefit both sides. However, in thinking about your equation of this contest of power with sort of demonic forces, if I've heard you correctly, I think that is when there is a strong disequilibrium of power. I don't think that happens when the power between the parties is roughly equal. I think when it gets out of balance, then it does become satanic. Then it does become getting as much as you can and giving as little as possible. So I like the way you put it. I think it arises from the disproportion of power rather than from power itself.
But I just pick up on one little aspect of what you said, John, before we move on to other issues. It's the term neoliberalism. How do you see that in relation to liberalism? Do you see any difference, or is it just a new word for what you've been talking about?
Yeah, well, I think it's like getting a new coat of paint on your car. It makes it look real nice, but it doesn't make it a new car. So you may have a Neo Chevy when you get a coat of paint on it, but it's still a Chevy, you know. And liberalism, neo or otherwise, neo or paleo, is still liberalism. And the debates between the neo and the paleo liberals, frankly, are somewhat unproductive because, as I've noted before, in any debate between a liberal and a liberal, the liberal will win every time.
All right. Well, I guess that's the head to that question. Yes, somebody's in the background there. I can't. Who's that? I have to jump in.
Stefan, it's Keith Harvey here.
Yes, Keith. Yes, I was going to hand over to you. Go for it.
Oh, thank you, Stefan. First of all, I apologise. I'm doing this on a mobile phone, so it's an issue of quality. I apologise. But yeah, I put the question in to the chat about wage justice, and so John's already mentioned that briefly. But so my background is in the Australian trade union movement. But I've also got a strong interest in Catholic social teaching, and including role of cooperatives. So I agree with John about that. But I was interested in his comments about equalisation of power and all the imbalance of power between the employer and the workers, and that wages result from that power imbalance, not from productivity and other issues. But I just wanted to ask John, if I could, about in his longer paper that went around a couple of weeks ago when this Zoom meeting was convened, he goes on to say that there's a couple of solutions to the imbalance. One, he says, was that the government could massively intervene on the side of the worker, or the worker could become substantially unionised. Now, I support the second one, but John goes on to say both of these solutions involve massive dangers. These could be cures worse than the disease. So I was a bit puzzled about that, particularly the last comment. What would be wrong with workers, improving their bargaining power to reach those sort of more equal agreements that John was just talking about, particularly given the role, the importance of unions in Catholic social teaching, going back to Rerum Novarum and before that as well. And I completely support cooperatives, but until we get to that point of having a more, an economy based more on cooperatives, we've got to deal with the fact that most people are still wage earners and will be for a long time to come. So just wondering if John could expand on that a little bit. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely, the worker has to have greater power than he does. He cannot be in the situation where basically he has to accept what the market offers. There is a problem, however. The proper understanding of the opposing powers is to find a way to unite them in a common cause. Okay, with unions, they never ever actually get united to the the proper ends of business, and it becomes just a pure contest. And then I think that situation that Carl was talking about arises in that pure contest of power. So what the cooperative does is that everybody's united in the same goal. Okay, so everybody's power is sort of directed at the same ends, at an end that is mutually beneficial to both sides. So we had here in the United States, for example, where the power of the auto workers union became totally disproportionate, and it was not able to respond to competition from Japan, because originally Japan was, their products were laughable. Their first introduction was the Toyo Pet in the 50s, and it was described as 4 wheels and an ashtray. And so nobody took it seriously, but the Japanese learned quickly, and they soon were beating us up in our own home markets. I think that a proper cooperation between capital and labor could have maintained the position of the American auto industry. And a cooperative set of management, or at least co-determination, as is practiced in Europe, could have come up with a better response than what they did, which is basically to outsource everything to Mexico or to Southeast Asia, et cetera, or to Canada. So that's the kind of example I'm talking about, where when the power is viewed as something in opposition to each other, rather than as a way to cooperate with each other, then I think you have different understandings of power. So you can have what Carl was talking about, I think that's very, very accurate in those sort of contest situations, okay, rather than cooperative hours. Does that get close to what you were talking about?
Yes, well, I understand. I understand better what you mean. I think they do need, as I say, I think cooperatives is the way to go because there is that unity of purpose. But until we get to that, I mean, one of the downsides of very low unionisation rates in the United States, as well as now in Australia as well, is that, as you mentioned before, the worker share of income. You know, the employers have been, you know, winning that battle, you know, for 20 or 30 years now, and wage shares both in the United States and in Australia are very low. And we don't want the government to be the consumer of last resort. We have to increase the consumer purchasing power as well. But I think I've had more than a fair go. So thanks, John, for your thoughts on it. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you so much. I just want to take, I just see Anthony McMullen posted a question here. Liberals versus liberals. Is Steve Bannon a liberal? Steve Bannon is the quintessential 19th century liberal, which we today call conservative.
All right, that's the answer to that, Anthony. I see actually a couple more interesting questions in the chat. Mark Lingson was there. Mark, would you like to pick up on that? Because I think your question actually follows on quite well from where we've been at the moment.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me?
We can.
Beautiful. All right. Yeah, I think just looking at the comments that have followed on from what I put in there is people are concerned that workers are gradually and inexorably losing power, losing wage equality. And there just doesn't seem to be any way that we can address the fact that the ruling classes appear to be getting stronger, more powerful, and more well paid. I just get sick of hearing about CEOs who earn 500 times what the lowest paid worker earns in their company, and yet 40 or 50 years ago, that ratio was only like 40 times. There doesn't seem to be anything that we can do about it. So my question is, I feel angry all the time, I have to admit, when I hear what's going on in the world. And it's very frustrating, and you just wonder what the hell we can do to address this. And I'm just be interested to know, John, how you feel about that.
Yes, and it's it wasn't that it was 200 or even 20 times. It was as low as 7 times. The CEO would make 7 to 10 times what the worker made. Now, if you make 10 times what the average line worker makes, you will have a pretty good life. You will have a nice house, you will have a nice car, you will have a nice life, okay? But then Carl's definition of power comes in, and that's power that becomes greedy, that can never have enough. And if you can never have enough, you know, if you have 50 million, you know, you really think you're entitled to 200 million. And if you have 200 million, you really think you're entitled to 1 billion. And that's the problem with the man of desires. The man of desires is never, ever satisfied. No matter what he has, he thinks he needs more. So Elon Musk with billions, I don't know how many billions, he feels kind of shortchanged. And so he needs to enter politics to get more money. But that's a sad way to live. As I like to tell my students, the most important word you can learn in life is enough. Okay? Because when you have enough, you have everything you need. But if you want everything, you can never have enough.
That's great. You're just preaching to the converted here, mate. But the problem is there's too many bastards running corporations. What do we do about these pricks?
Yeah, well, the politically, we just have to make that an issue. We have to make it an issue that it's a question of corporate power versus worker power, and it has to be stated in those terms. And we have to. We're easily seduced by cultural issues, you know. Well, in the United States, you know, and We're worried about women getting too powerful, or blacks getting too powerful, or Mexicans. Mexicans, they're coming across the border, etc. And so the working class can be kept busy with these issues that, frankly, don't make a dime's bit of difference. But nevertheless, they can sway elections because cultural. I mean, Andrew Breitbart was right. Politics is downstream of culture. What he did miss, however, is culture is downstream of breakfast. That is, the economic system, any cultural system is dependent upon its economic system. So we have to address cultural issues in a different way, and we cannot be sidelined, cannot allow ourselves to be sidelined, to get all worked up about cultural issues, which are a different kind of battle, and concentrate on the political issues. You know, a lot of people in the United States, and I'm thinking of the Trump revolution, Trump, who was able to capture the working class, even though he despises them, and I mean outright despises them. But he was able to play these cultural issues, immigration. You know, they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs. This fear of women, this fear of foreign cultures, immigration, etc., etc. And so bypass all the issues that really, really matter to us. We have to concentrate on those real issues and relate them to how people actually live.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Could I just jump in on this issue of the different wage differentials, John? You know, like Leo the 13th came out saying there's got to be a minimum wage, which was a response to that first era of liberalism. But nobody's ever talked about in Catholic teaching that I know of in terms of a maximum wage. In fact, the only ones that I know talk about a maximum wage is Mondragon. Is it time to start talking about that, do you think?
Absolutely. There has to be a maximum wage. There has to be punitive taxes on incomes. Now, in the 1950s, the maximum income tax, the marginal tax rate was as high as 93%. 93%. Now, I doubt if anybody actually paid 93%, but it was important. It was very important because it makes no sense to give your CEO a $50 million bonus if 93% of that bonus is just going to be taxed away. So it served an important social function. Okay. Then the philosophy reversed and it became the idea, well, if you can make the CEO rich through the company, then it'll be better for the company. The CEO will raise the company up so his own compensation increases. That, in fact, is not what happens. But that's how it changed, and that's how we got these totally outlandish salary packages that you see that is commonplace among a CEO today.
Thanks, John. I see Anthony. Yeah, you did mention Anthony's question earlier, but Anthony, you've got a few more comments there. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, look, I had a question around growing the mutual economy and investment. And I think one of the key kind of challenges that we have is that, there is an impact investing movement that are trying to, invest in good things, but they still operate on a way that they need a kind of a controlling interest, which has a problem with a cooperative enterprise because of the sovereignty of members. And even though they are, they're looking for social good, they're often seeking market or near market returns. And often that's baked into various structures. In Australia, in our superannuation system, it's very difficult to have investment into good things. And then you look at communities themselves that often struggle because, they haven't got quite enough resources to get something big growing. And then you get groups of people burning out through volunteerism, trying to set up something good. So you've kind of got this, I think this issue of investment and social investment's a really big one if we're going to grow the mutual economy in the new sort of, in this era. I'm wondering if you have any comments on that.
I do. I think it is important, but I think its effect is always going to be limited because it still has to deal with an underlying system. And every system, as Alistair McIntyre notes, every system sets up a system of rewards and sanctions. And it rewards certain behaviors and sanctions other behaviors. So I remember experience I had as teaching, and I was teaching one of my students was very, very much into this, and very much into the whole social justice thing, but she was a mortgage broker. And the mortgage business in the United States at that time absolutely rewarded dubious practices. And now for her own business, if she was going to advance in her own business, she had to, in effect, become an evil person. Well, I'm not here to make any judgment on what she did. She works within that system, and that's how she has to function in that system. So I'm not worried so much about the individual problem as the systemic problem.
Yeah.
So if we have a system that rewards CEOs in the way it does, a good CEO or a bad CEO really isn't the issue. The issue is the system of rewards we set up, which is going to make sure that the worst rise to the top.
It's interesting. Just a quick comment. I spoke to a CEO of a mutual bank credit union that's been going for 50 years, and they'd never foreclosed on a mortgage over that entire period.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, it's a bit of a hidden secret amongst the movement. They don't want to advertise it, but yeah. No, good point. Thank you, John.
Great. Thanks, Anthony. Rick Canal has got another question there. Over to you, Rick.
Oh, thank you. I've noticed a lot of the discussion so far this morning has revolved around this idea of the concentration of capital, whether we're talking about CEOs or more broadly. I'd like to broaden that idea out, that it is a phenomenon that may be seen as something that's specific to capitalism, but I would suggest that history shows that in fact it's a phenomenon that occurs whatever the socio-economic and political system that a group, a country works with or is under the influence of. So this seems to be a very basic phenomenon that occurs no matter what system we're working in, this concentration over time into fewer and fewer hands. You put forward distributism as an alternative, and it's one that I'm not very familiar with, but would you like to talk more about how this phenomenon, which seems to be very foundational, basic phenomenon, independent of systems, how would that be dealt with? How do you see that working out in a distributed economy, if that's the right term?
Oh,
apologies.
no, I think you've identified, I think, the correct issue. Yes, that this is not something unique to capitalism. It's something that happens before the downfall of each and every society. There is a group that gains control of the capital of that society and widens the gap between rich and poor. This is Mesopotamia, this is Rome, this is Greece. A great example of this is that in Greece, this nation of free city-states, well, in fact, they weren't free. Most of the people had been reduced to debt slavery, and it's usually debt slavery is the primary indication of what's happening. Well, we have this idea that Rome conquered Greece. Rome did not conquer Greece. The people of Greece rebelled against the oligarchs, and the oligarchs called in the Roman army to put down the local rebellions. So it was a combination of the Romans working with the Greek aristocrats, really oligarchs, that ended Greek civilization and led to the rise of Roman civilization. But that's the same thing. If you look at China, India, South America, the Maya had the same, the Inca had the same problem, which is one reason that the Spanish could so easily conquer them. So yes, it's a historical constant. And the second part was, well, what would we do about it? We have to recapitalize the middle class and the poor. We have to demand some sort of ownership of the company should be part of the wage. And the reason for this is that capital, so there's an original capital that founds any company, okay? And those people who provide that capital have every right to a decent return or even a high return. But capital, like labor, is consumed in production. And it is labor that replaces capital. And since labor replaces capital, labor should come into some ownership of capital. But the capital that founded the Ford Motor Company, or whatever it might be, is now gone. That original capital disappeared a long time ago, was replaced by the capital produced by the workers. The workers should have some share in that capital, and that needs to be established as just a principle of compensation for workers.
Great. Thanks, John. I see we've got two more questions there, and we're nearly going for an hour now. Brian, would you like to comment on your question? Is ego also a factor in wage injustice?
Thanks, Stefan, and thanks very much, John, for an excellent presentation. While the conversation was going on about wage injustice, I just did a quick little Google search to do a test case, and I discovered that the headmaster of a government school with 1,200 pupils will earn somewhere between $168,000 and $225,000, which is probably a pretty reasonable wage for that responsibility. I then replaced government high school with prestigious private school. And that took me to an article in one of the newspapers that flagged that principals in prestigious private schools are earning somewhere up around the $600,000 to $700,000, upwards even getting close to $1 million. And I wondered whether, as well as the driver of greed that we've talked about, and the driver of power that we've talked about, there's a driver of ego. In other words, my school is better than your school because I pay my principal more than you pay your principal. And it took me back to the three temptations of Jesus in the desert. You know, the materialism we've talked about, the power we've talked about. And I wonder, and the reason I got curious about it was yesterday I had lunch with a lawyer who acts for a lot of Catholic school agencies, and that's my world of church governance, of this creeping wage pressure in our welfare agencies and school agencies to what I think are unsustainable and quite unrealistic levels, because of the need to compete at the level of prestige. I just throw that in for consideration.
There's a whole bunch there. That's all very good. Starting with ego. Ego is indeed, I think, the primary factor. But there's also, these schools are not there to give an education. They're there to separate people by class. Okay, it's a sorting function. So you go to an institution like Harvard. I don't know that there's any evidence to say that Harvard gives you a better education. But what Harvard does do is give you better connections. Okay, you're going to meet a whole different set of people. And these people form sort of a clique. And that's the same is true with these pricey private schools, including I'm sad to say, pricey Catholic schools. Okay, our system is not free from this temptation to function as sorting mechanisms. So these pricey schools, what they should be doing is using these high prices to fund people who can't pay for that kind of education at all. But that's not what they do, or if they do it only on a token basis. All right. And so they're not fulfilling, I think, the mission of Catholic education if that education is confined to a class or mostly to a class that can afford that. So I think, does that answer your question? Does it? Okay, thank you.
All right. Yeah, wow. Look, let's go to Greg Pierce, who's got a question which may well actually kind of help us to conclude, I think. Greg, would you like to speak to your comment?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me. This is my first one of these, and I learned a lot from this particular discussion. I do note that most of us are about the same age. We have Nancy here, we have Clement here, but it's really a lot of us talking to each other. And it struck me when the Pope, the new Pope, got 1 million young people, and I understand that it's a movement thing, you know, and a thing for kids to do, but it's 1 million people. And if he could reach some of them, not all of them, you don't have to reach all of them, but I know the history of Cardine, and I know the history of, I'm also very involved with the National Center for the Laity, which a lot of you know about because we do that newsletter initiatives, and we've been doing that since 1978. But anyway, what we're going to try to do here in the United States, at least, is see if we can get some of the institutions, parishes, vicariates, dioceses, schools, community organizations, to hold little Zoom calls or even in-person meetings with 15 people or so, and read Rerum Novarum and ask them what they think about this. Now, we're not going to be at the level that we are tonight about, you know, understanding of this stuff, but if we don't get a new generation of people that see the church in a different way, so I guess my question was, and we're going to try to do it here. I don't know if it'll work, but we're going to try to talk to 50,000 people in the next 3 years and get them to read Rerum Novarum. And I'm also anticipating that when Pope Leo XIV does his encyclical, there's some indication that he will revisit a lot of this stuff about economics, including AI, but also, you know, just the stuff that was written about in 1891. And so I just asked it just as a general question, both in Australia and here, have we given up on the young people? Or is there any way we could use this particular opportunity of an American Pope from the south side of Chicago, who surprisingly, more surprising that there was an American Pope was that he chose the name Leo XIV, as far as I was concerned.
Yeah.
And use that to get beyond what's going on in a lot of our parishes, to get young people. You know, I'm not talking about teenagers. I'm talking about young people in their 20s and 30s.
Yep.
To see if
and teenagers. And I think that,
of course, and teenagers.
And
but I'd be happy with some 20-year-olds or some 30-year-olds that are actually out.
I think we have a message to give them, and I think this Pope understands that. I think this was Leo XIV. That was a deliberate choice, and that announced what he wants to do. And he's been very, very active on social media. Okay, so he's a Twitter Pope. He means to reach the young people. Now, I think John Paul II wanted to do that as well, and he was somewhat successful. But we have the message for the young people. And I think, yes, we absolutely need to be more involved with the children. And with all due respect to everybody here, including myself, there's quite a few gray beards here, okay?
So
Not
here's
everybody's on camera. Not everybody's on camera, but there's quite a few gray beards here. But I know, as being a teacher for 20 years, that young students, young business students, because those are my main students, do respond to this message. Okay, so we just have to deliver it. And
all right.
they are looking for something, but we have to learn their idiom. We have to learn social media. God help us. We have to evangelize according to the times. You know.
Yeah. Well, what I just want to make an offer to everybody on here. We just published a new English version of Rerum Novarum, and we didn't do a new translation. All we did was put in the fact that the human race is made up of male and female, and so we made more inclusive male-female pronouns and nouns, so that people could read it and understand what the Pope was talking about 134 years ago. So if any, I'm going to put my email in this chat. If anybody wants a free copy, just send me your address. Even if it's in Australia, I'll mail it to you. Or I might send you a PDF file. But in any case, that's what we're going to try to do. I just wanted to share that with everybody.
Fantastic.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much. And I noticed Christine Savage made a comment on that. What does it mean for the voice of women and young people in our church today? And women is the other area where we have to reach out to. So women and young people, absolutely. And Gregory, if there's any help I can give to that effort, well, you just contact me.
How about this? I'm going to send you. I'm giving you my email address. You give me yours.
Okay, well, I'm going to put my email address, and in case we run out of time but people still have questions, I'm more than happy to work with anybody who wants to work.
Yeah. We probably
on
ought to wrap
this.
up. We probably ought to wrap up the formal section. If there's a little bit of informal chat to continue, that's great too. But I think here is a good time to wrap up with that offer from Greg, and even foreshadowing some future discussions that we might organise and action, especially targeting women and young people. Yeah, that'd be fantastic. So I think that's really actually great. They're great conclusions to this session with you, John. So personally, and also on behalf of the Australian Cardinal Institute, I'd just like to thank you. And I think, it's going to take us not just a few more webinars, but a whole movement, let's say, as Greg has implied, to pick up on these issues and to find how we can mobilise a new generation, our successors, to act on them. So thanks very much, John. And we'll see you all at our future webinars. Thanks again.
And thank you all for your attention and for your good questions. I really am flattered. Thank you.